Hey, y'all. Thanks for joining our presentation today. My name is Christian Santamaria, and I serve as a campus minister at the University of Notre Dame.
And my name is James Luisi. I serve as a campus minister at St. Ignatian High School in Cleveland, Ohio. We're excited to present to you today our presentation called Building a Bridge Between Contemplation and Action, a faith that does justice through a ministry of transformative learning. Forming emerging adults spans the high school and the college levels. So in our presentation today, we hope to acknowledge the challenges that make this kind of formation challenging, both for our students and for us as ministers. Our goal is to begin to lay out the landscape of this formation process in order to imagine together some strategies that we hope lead our emerging adults to be faith-filled people committed to working for justice.
So here's a bit of an overview of our presentation today. We'll first take a look at the factors in formation in emerging adulthood when it comes to faith and justice formation. Then we'll kind of take a look at what James and I have been grappling with, this gap between contemplation and action that we're seeing in our students and in ways that they participate in our programs. And finally, how do we recognize that maybe transformative learning, popularized by Jack Mesereau, is actually a really wonderful way as ministerial praxis of bringing these two pieces of contemplation and action together. Well, before we get into the meat of our content here, I think it's helpful to draw into where it is that we're, what example of contemplation and action we are drawing from. And yes, Ignatius speaks a bit about this, but really we want to go back to its original source here. It's Jesus. And we find him right before he goes through the passion of the cross. We find him here with his friends, reclining after the foot washing experience in the Gospel of John. And he shares for a moment a glimpse in his inner life. He shares a bit of what he's been contemplating about. He says, "So that they may be one, as we are one, I and them, you and me, that they may be brought to perfection." What's beautiful about this is Jesus's own contemplation leads him to action, leads him to giving of himself for the growth of another. I think this is what we're trying to foster in terms of what we mean by contemplatives in action. We want students to develop this inner life that invites them to give of themselves for the growth of others in their community. So this is what we're hoping for today. Now the question is, how do we foster this type of formation? In this next section, we're going to be looking at the factors of formation in emerging adulthood. First, we're going to start with cognitive development theory, popularized by Robert Kegan.
So in Kegan's cognitive development theory, it's really a theory of how we develop socially. So what Kegan posits is that until we're about 6 years old, we're basically not aware that other people exist. And it's about that time, though, that when we turn 6, that we become aware that other people do exist, but we move into what he calls the second order, where we mostly view other people as instruments, as ways to get what we need. So until about adolescence, we're in this second order of the instrumental mind, where we're aware that other people exist, but we're mostly aware of them insofar as they provide benefits to us. So for example, a teenager might be aware that his mom and dad provide groceries, that they provide shelter, basic necessities, things like that. It's when the adolescent begins to move into the third order that that person becomes more aware of relationships, especially being aware of other human beings having their own interior life and beginning to value the relationship between other human beings, not just insofar as they can provide things that that individual needs. So the reason that we highlight the second order and third order is because for our students in high school and college, they fall into one of these two groups typically. So what's also important to note, though, is that Kegan doesn't set an age limit for when one sort of proceeds out of the second order into the third order. It's really a process of development that is more so dependent upon the maturity of the individual. So you could, in theory, have somebody in college who mostly is viewing people instrumentally. They're stuck kind of in that second order. Or you could have somebody who has already proceeded to develop maturity in their relationships and begin to value relationships who's in high school. And again, the reason that we're kind of focusing on these two movements, the second order and the third order, is because this is the stage that our emerging adults are at in high school and in college. They're beginning to value relationships.
Now, this cognitive development doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so the next few presentation slides, we're going to be looking at what are the cultural dynamics that this cognitive development is happening in our current paradigm in our high schools and our colleges. First, it's one that we like to call the era of individualism. We're drawing from the work here of Jean Twenge. She is a generational researcher who's specifically looking at the millennial generation and in iGen. And there are three areas of her research that were of particular import for us when it comes to naming what this context is like. The first one is that the NPI score has risen 65% from 2009 to 1982. The NPI measures narcissistic tendencies. It's the narcissistic personality inventory. It's not to say that it is a tool that diagnoses clinical narcissism, but it is a tool that that measures self-centered behavior found within a particular group of people. Interestingly, that the group of people, of young adults surveyed in 1982 compared to that of 2009, the scores of narcissistic tendencies has gone up 65%. Jean Twenge also notes that young adults don't necessarily need adults to access information. Even in the college setting, as professors are lecturing on a particular topic, students are actually fact-checking them on their phones or on their computers. The idea that only adults have the answers is not something that young adults subscribe to. They have agency in their ability to research for themselves or access the internet through their phones, to tablets, to their computers. And finally, a huge part of the identity formation that happened for these emerging adults, particularly their childhood, is what's known as the self-esteem curriculum. Maybe some of you have experienced this as well. How many of us got a trophy if you just showed up to soccer practice? Or how many of us got a ribbon just for entering into the science fair? This idea that was in response to World War II of making sure that our young adults had good self-esteems growing up has some unintended consequences. That a message was sent that no matter what one does, at the heart of it, they're good, which is not necessarily a bad idea. I think what's confusing sometimes for young adults is that their actions and who they are, they seemingly have a hard time connecting those two things. Just because I do something bad, I'm not bad, so what does it matter if I do something bad? These are some of the signs of the times that indicate in some way that we find ourselves in a culture that prioritizes or even encourages individualistic activity.
This leads into the third point that we like to highlight, is that we live in an era of polarization. I think we can all agree that we can see this all around us, but we also see it in our church. So you can see just by some of this information from the Pew Research Center that even in the Catholic Church, opinions are increasingly polarized along political lines. So if we continue through the research here, it's not, our point isn't really to highlight these particular issues, but just to highlight the fact that polarization, which is a political reality that we face, is even something that's appearing in our church. So much so that majorities of Trump and Biden voters say they have just a few or no friends who support the other candidate. Christian and I don't bring this up to make any judgments. We're just highlighting the fact that polarization is something that's out there in the water that our emerging adults are having to navigate. So what we're interested in is how are these trends of this being an important moment where our emerging adults are trying to identify and name the relationships that they're in, also fighting the forces of individualism that they're being pushed into, and also fighting the forces of polarization. These are all things that make up the landscape that our emerging adults are in, and that we are, as ministers, are attempting to do ministry in.
So it leads us to this kind of final question for this segment. If this cognitive development of recognizing relationality is happening within a context of individualism and extreme polarization, what assumptions might our students have in high school and in college about life, about faith, about God, about what justice is? Consider that for a moment before we enter into our next segment. In the next section of our presentation, entitled The Gap Between Contemplation and Action, we recognize some of these general trends that both James and I are recognizing in our pastoral setting at the high school and at the university. The reality is that these two really important charisms of contemplation and action are distinct. One is involving the inner life, and one is involving the way in which we relate to the world. However, although they're distinct, they don't necessarily mean they need to be divided. But that's how we're recognizing some of that happening within our church and with our settings today. This question of identity formation, of as the students are grappling with their call to relationality, they're also grappling with the context of individualism and this context of polarization, which sometimes makes them have to choose. Do I move toward the charism of contemplation? Am I the student who goes to Mass and does the sacraments? Or am I the student of social action who volunteers, who protests, as if these two things are not necessarily connected? But I think before we talk about that gap, it's helpful first to talk about the fruits of these charisms. So for the charism of contemplation, what's really beautiful about this aspect of the life of the church and the life of students attracted to it, it brings so much importance to the inner life, to one's personal relationship with God, to one's being in good standing with God. It also recognizes the richness of ritual and practice as a grounding for identity. This idea that it's not who I am, but whose I am that's important for those falling within this charism, that the belonging to God has everything to do with how they see themselves and how they see their identity. And lastly, there's a trust and desire to know God and their calling in the world. For a lot of our students, particularly in the college level, this devotion to the contemplative life is one that hopes to see where God might be inviting them to love moving forward. These are some of the real wonderful fruits of the charism of contemplation.
For our students who find themselves drawn to the charism of social action, they exhibit wonderful fruits of the Spirit. They're aware of their belonging and solidarity to their brothers and sisters who are marginalized, excluded, experiencing violence, who are forgotten. They intimately understand what we mean when we say that our schools are hoping to transform them into people for and with us. They long for our institutions to be leaders in speaking out against injustice, and they do so courageously. They recognize that all of creation is intimately connected and that we are meant to live in right relationship with each other and the world. That might not be the language that they would use, but I think that's what we see as ministers in our context, that they intuitively know this.
What's interesting in both of our pastoral settings is we're recognizing that students are silently making this choice between these charisms, this charism of contemplation and this charism of social action. And we wonder how much of this is caused by this kind of idea of individualism and surrounding yourself with others who think just like you, or this understanding of polarization, that we want to be around the people who believe like us, all of which is happening while the students are trying to figure out what relationship means to them in their cognitive development. What's really important here is if we recognize the fruits of these charisms, we also have to recognize what they miss out when they're not integrated together. For those who are strictly drawn to the charism of contemplation, they lose sight of the fact that that love is messy, mercy is messy, forgiveness is messy, it's unclear, it's unwieldy. This idea that faith calls us to the broken, even the brokenness within ourselves, as a way to encounter God. And that brokenness is not something necessarily we have to fix right away. It's something that we're being invited to hold. And this one is significant, that Jesus' command to us, Jesus' calling for us, is to love one another as I have loved you. This particular mandate is inherently social, not private. To love one another as I have loved you has direct social impact for those who find themselves drawn only to the charism of contemplation.
And so on the other side of the split that we have, for our students who are drawn to the charism of social action, sometimes the students who find themselves drawn exclusively here, they might do so because they actually carry wounds from their relationship with the church. And that is something that has to be acknowledged, respected, and treated with tenderness. But we as ministers also need to encourage them and to recognize that and to name that for them, that the church needs them. The church needs them. It needs their witness. We also need to recognize that for their formation, they are missing important ingredients from the contemplative life that are necessary to sustained work for justice. And this is because the road to justice is a long one. And it's quite often filled with disappointment and the reality of injustice. We desire for these students to be able to have a relationship with the one who has experienced injustice. And by that, I mean Jesus, the crucified one, who also found solace in his Father, whom he called Abba, Daddy. The student who toils in social action also needs a sense of justice that is beyond themselves, or else they risk never being able to rest while in their pursuit of justice. It helps, in other words, to remember that it is God's reign that we pursue and not our own, and that we are prophets of a future not our own.
And so for us as practitioners, as ministers, how do we bridge this? How do we form contemplatives in action in an individualized and polarized world that has made itself known even in the spiritual formation that our students are experiencing? In the final section of our presentation today, we're going to be talking about transformative learning theory popularized by Jack Mezirow. Why this is important. As we talked about in our first section, as our students are beginning to recognize the demands of relationship in their life, they also find themselves in these cultural paradigms of individualism and polarization that comes with it a lot of assumptions about what faith, about what God, about what justice might mean. So transformative learning theory addresses that specifically. Because at first, transformative learning is not what Jack Mezirow calls simple learning, the idea that we're just adding more information to our students' kind of data bank of information. For example, simple learning would be if we were talking about God's love, about giving them more books or inviting them to read further or broadening their understanding by doing an exegesis on John's gospel or whatever. That would be just more information being added to the consciousness of the student. Rather, for transformative learning, it refers to this process of transforming taken for granted frames of references. So maybe this idea of recognizing one's fullness of identity is inherently individual and not necessarily in the context of relationship, not necessarily inclusive, but constantly polarizing. Transformative learning is actually looking at that taken for granted framework and inviting that student to actually consider a new way, which leads to what Jack Mezirow calls a disorienting dilemma. Something that what this might look like in a ministry praxis might be, for example, introducing someone to Catholic social teaching who might come from the contemplative charism, or from the social active charism, introducing them to the work of Thomas Merton and contemplation. Wait, the faith has something to say about the connection of contemplation and action? Wait, the church has something to say about its role in the world and liturgy? How is that possible? This is what Jack Mezirow would call the disorienting dilemma. Now, in transformative learning theory, there's this really important understanding of holding places. This in-between place between the ending of a particular frame of reference and then the new beginning of a new frame of reference. So using the examples I just mentioned, sharing with someone about Catholic social teaching who might be coming from the contemplative charism, where the church has something to say about social interactions. So it's not just about me and God. There's an ending. And now this new beginning of like, how do I recognize the church's invitation to its social implication? Here's this new beginning. So I think it's helpful to define these pieces. So again, this ending is really the beginning, but it's the ending of a particular paradigm that the student might have come with. This neutral zone is really important. It's the in-between phase. It's actually where the most ministry happens. It's where we can accompany young adults as they try on new paradigms. They try on new ways of understanding and holding in tension, in this case, this tension between contemplation and action. And finally, the end, or the new beginning. It's this idea that the student now has a new way of holding these realities together. So if we put this back into this understanding of holding places, we could actually see holding places as ministerial. It's the place of one paradigm dying, holding firm on the other hand, this kind of authentic movement toward an integrated charism. And this is where we come in. This compassionate, encouraging, hopeful space in between. This place where we hold firm with our students and walk with them as they stitch these two pieces back together. For me, at the University of Notre Dame, I teach a class called The Spirituality of Justice. And predominantly the students who come into that course are students who are really part of that social justice charism, that social active charism. And they're asking the question, what the heck does contemplation or reflection or forgiveness or reconciliation, these things that are seemingly so private, does that have anything to do with social justice? And in this course, we kind of attack those assumptions. Is the personal spiritual life simply that personal? And they have to grapple, what are the social implications of the Christian spiritual life? Throughout this course, I hold this holding place with them as they grapple and find a new way to hold this paradigm together. James, do you ever see this happening in your ministry setting in the high school?
I do, and I would say that it's important to remember that these disorienting dilemmas do not have to be utterly earth-shattering. They can be simple.
Yeah.
One example that comes readily to mind is over the summer, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, our group, Ignatians for Peace and Justice, was meeting over Zoom, and our students were very interested in organizing some sort of response. But it seemed that at least part of their struggle was coming to terms with a reality that they have little control over, and one that causes fear and upsetting emotions. And so at that time, I found it helpful to remind them that Jesus is somebody who knows what it's like to be in that setting. So what I attempted to do was to take a biblical story that they thought that perhaps they understood or had it encountered before, but perhaps hadn't thought of in this particular context. So being able to imagine themselves there with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as he knows that his death is on the horizon and that there's not much that he can do to stop it and that it's scary and uncomfortable for him, helps them to understand that those are feelings that Jesus in his full humanity also understood and grappled with, but that it's not the end of the story because we also have the hope of the resurrection. And that's something that Jesus is also looking forward to in that moment. So that's just one small example of how even a story that perhaps we take for granted that they already know from their own scripture studies at the high school level, it can help to make sense, if only in a little way, of their own uncomfortable emotions in this moment and to begin to pray with them in addition to working for social justice.
Thanks, James. So what are the characteristics of these holding environments, these places where we walk with students and accompany them as they create a new paradigm of holding contemplation and action together? The first one is that we hold well, that we are committed to them and support them without confining them or actually rushing the process along, to allow them to put this new paradigm together and simply be with them as they go on and do so. The second piece is the encouragement beyond the existent understanding. Kind of like what James says, you're telling me that this terrible experience of George Floyd and the experience of Jesus have something to do together? these are these small moments of encouraging them. Yeah, our faith has something to say about injustice, that Christ experienced injustice himself, that these two things are connected. These small movements of encouragement are really important for this holding environment as ministry. And finally, we offer consistency and stability. That we recognize too here that part of that consistency and stability is to model this for our students. Maybe for us, we might find ourselves most drawn to the charism of the contemplative. What does it mean for us to model for our students to create consistency and stability, to be constantly out and amongst the community, serving the poor, and vice versa? If we find ourselves moving more toward the charism of the social action, what does it mean for us to be mindful of our inner life, to model reflection, to model prayer? These are really crucial pieces of what allows us to be formators, hoping to bring back together this tension between contemplation and action that is so pivotal to the formation of our students. That's the end of our presentation today. On behalf of James and I, thank you for watching.
Please reach out to us through Swapcard. We do not claim to be experts in the field of ministry, so we'd love to learn from you so that we can continue to work collaboratively together in the shared work of forming emerging adults who live a faith that does justice.
Thanks, y'all.